I still remember the first time I looked at my city not just as the place where I was born, but as a reflection of something broken inside me. The cracked sidewalks, the abandoned buildings, the empty stares of people who had given up, everything seemed like a mirror of despair. It wasn't just poverty or crime, it was the silence, the resignation, the quiet acceptance that this was all life would ever be. I walked through those streets as a young man with questions burning in my chest, questions about purpose, hope, and whether faith could actually change anything beyond the four walls of a church. At that time, I was nothing more than a dreamer, a voice too small for anyone to hear. But deep inside, something whispered to me, what if one person believed enough to stand up? What if one spark could set a whole city ablaze with hope? That thought didn't leave me, it haunted me, challenged me, and eventually, it demanded an answer. The truth is, I wasn't the kind of person people expected to lead anything. I was quiet, uncertain, and often doubted my own worth. But when I walked past the park where children played with no shoes, or the corner where people gathered to drown their pain in bottles, I felt a pull stronger than fear. I started to speak, not in grand sermons or polished speeches, but in conversations with strangers, in prayers whispered in alleys, in small acts of kindness that no one clapped for. At first, it seemed pointless. People looked at me with suspicion, some even mocked me, asking how faith could fill an empty stomach or keep bullets from flying at night. And honestly, I asked myself the same question. But I kept going, because every time I reached out to someone, I felt the undeniable truth. Change doesn't start with a city, it starts with a single heart. Slowly, something shifted. I remember the first man who came back to me weeks after I prayed with him. He had been lost in addiction, but he said that for the first time in years, he had gone a whole week sober. Then there was the single mother who told me that the words I shared gave her the courage to apply for a job, and she had just been hired. These were small victories, but they felt like miracles. And miracles have a way of multiplying when people begin to believe. Soon, a few others joined me, not because I asked them to, but because they saw what was happening. We weren't just talking about faith, we were living it, breathing it, letting it pour out into the streets like light into darkness. But the city didn't change overnight. There were setbacks, moments that made me want to quit. I'll never forget the night one of the young men I mentored was caught in the crossfire of a gang dispute. I stood in the hospital, watching him fight for his life, and anger burned inside me. I asked God why He would let this happen if we were fighting for something good. The silence of that night nearly broke me. Yet, in the stillness, I realized that faith isn't about being spared from pain, it's about refusing to let pain have the final word. That young man survived, and though he carried scars, he also carried a new determination, to live differently, to be a voice against the very violence that nearly claimed him. The ripple effect was undeniable. What started with one prayer became a movement. Abandoned lots were transformed into community gardens. The same streets once ruled by fear became the ground for open-air gatherings filled with music, laughter, and testimonies of lives being rebuilt. People who had never set foot in a church began showing up, not because of religion, but because they saw real hope growing where there had only been despair. It wasn't me. It was faith, alive and contagious, moving through people like fire. There was one night I'll never forget. We organized a gathering in the very heart of the city, the square that had been a symbol of crime and corruption. Thousands showed up, not to protest, not to riot, but to sing, to pray, to stand side by side as proof that light still existed. As I looked at the crowd, tears filled my eyes. For the first time, I saw my city not as broken, but as beautiful, because faith had opened our eyes to the possibility of transformation. That night, the mayor stood beside us, speechless, as he admitted he had never seen the people so united. Faith became our currency, our weapon, our foundation. And the stories continued to pour in, families restored, gangs disbanded, schools filled with mentors who once had been dropouts themselves. It was as if the city had remembered who it was meant to be, and faith was the mirror that showed us our reflection again. I realized then that transformation doesn't come from power, politics, or wealth. It comes from faith that refuses to bow to fear. Years have passed since those first trembling steps I took, and today, when people ask me how one person could possibly change a city, I smile. Because the answer is simple: one person can't. But one person with faith can ignite others, and together, that faith becomes unstoppable. I am living proof that when you believe, truly believe, in something greater than yourself, walls crumble, chains break, and entire cities rise again. So when I tell you that faith transformed my city, I'm not telling you a fairy tale. I'm telling you what I saw, what I lived, what I carried in my own trembling hands. And I tell it to you now because maybe, just maybe, you're standing in your own broken city, wondering if change is possible. And if you are, hear me when I say this: it is. Because faith doesn't just transform cities, it transforms people. And when people are transformed, nothing in this world can stay the same. I never imagined that the very streets once avoided at night would one day become symbols of safety and community. Where fear once reigned, children now play without worry, their laughter echoing off the walls of buildings that had been abandoned for decades. Streetlights shine brighter, not just because they were repaired, but because people themselves became lights, illuminating the darkest corners with hope. I still walk through those streets, sometimes stopping just to listen, to absorb the sound of a city reborn. Every smile I see reminds me of the nights when I doubted this was even possible. But here it is, a living testimony that faith, when put into action, can rebuild more than walls. It can restore dignity. Businesses began to return, drawn not by profit alone, but by the undeniable energy of a city that believed in itself again. Cafes opened on corners where silence once lingered, bookstores filled with children eager to read, and small shops run by families who once thought they had no future here. People weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving, dreaming again, daring to hope that tomorrow would be brighter than today. I watched neighbors who had never spoken before now working side by side, building something greater than themselves. Faith didn't just feed souls, it fueled ambition, creativity, and unity. That was the greatest miracle of all, watching people discover the power within themselves. One of the most inspiring transformations came from the youth. The same young people once labeled as lost causes became leaders, mentors, and visionaries. I'll never forget when a former gang leader, a man feared by many, stood on a stage and spoke about forgiveness, about choosing peace over violence. The crowd fell silent, not out of fear, but out of awe. His words carried the weight of lived redemption, and they resonated deeper than any sermon ever could. Faith had rewritten his story, and through him, it began to rewrite the story of an entire generation. Schools that had been failing were now flourishing. Volunteers, many of them people who once walked paths of despair, filled classrooms with encouragement and guidance. Dropout rates fell, graduation ceremonies were filled with proud parents wiping tears, and young men and women carried diplomas like crowns of victory. I often sat in the back, watching them walk across the stage, and I thought about the prayers whispered years earlier in the shadows of broken alleys. Each diploma, each proud smile, was an answered prayer. The ripple effect reached far beyond the city's borders. News outlets began to cover what was happening, calling it a revival, or a movement of hope. Visitors came from other towns, curious to see how faith had rebuilt what many had written off as lost. Some stayed, inspired to carry the same spirit back to their own communities. It was humbling to realize that our story was no longer just ours, it had become a beacon for others searching for their own spark of change. The city became a living testimony, a lighthouse shining into the distance. What touched me most deeply, though, was the restoration of families. Fathers who had walked away returned home. Mothers who had carried the burden alone found strength in community. Children who once lived in fear now lived in love, seeing their parents embrace healing and forgiveness. Homes were mended, not because of wealth or programs, but because faith taught us to rebuild from the inside out. That kind of transformation is priceless. I can still remember the night when thousands gathered in the heart of the city for a celebration of hope. There was no stage large enough for what happened. It wasn't about performances, it was about testimonies. One by one, people came forward, sharing their stories of redemption, courage, and new beginnings. The air was electric, charged with gratitude and tears. It was the moment I realized that faith had not only changed my city, it had given people their voices back. And those voices were stronger than any darkness. As the years passed, I watched leaders rise, not because they had titles or power, but because they carried hearts willing to serve. Our city council was filled with people who once sat hopeless on street corners. Our community centers were run by people who had once needed them. The shift was undeniable. Faith had created leaders, not just followers. And leadership rooted in faith is unshakable, because it serves not self, but others. Sometimes I'm asked if I ever get tired, if carrying this mission becomes heavy. My answer is always the same: how can I grow weary when every day I walk through a city that proves faith works? Every smile I pass, every hand I shake, every story I hear, it all fuels me. This isn't my success, it's ours. It belongs to every person who chose to believe when doubt was louder, who planted seeds when the soil looked barren. Together, we wrote a new chapter. And so, when I stand today in the very place where it all began, I no longer see brokenness, I see beauty. I no longer see despair, I see destiny. My city is living proof that faith, when held onto fiercely, can transform not just lives, but legacies. And though the journey has been long, and the battles were many, I can say with certainty, it was worth it. Because I didn't just witness a city change, I witnessed faith become flesh, hope become reality, and dreams become history written in the streets we call home. There is something deeply powerful about watching a broken city rise again, not because of wealth, politics, or chance, but because of faith and unity. And when we look closely at this story, we see that it is not just about one man or one city, it's about all of us. How many times have we walked through our own lives feeling like those empty streets, carrying cracks that no one sees, hiding despair behind silent walls? We may not be facing gangs or abandoned buildings, but we face fears, disappointments, failures, and struggles that make us wonder if change is even possible. This story reminds us that no matter how hopeless the situation looks, transformation begins with one choice, one act of courage, one moment of faith. Just as a city can be rebuilt, so can we, one decision at a time. The beauty of faith is that it doesn't demand perfection, it demands persistence. In our daily lives, this can mean choosing kindness when anger seems easier, offering forgiveness when resentment feels justified, or daring to dream when the world tells us to give up. Think about the workplace, the classroom, or even within our families. How many opportunities do we have each day to be that spark of change? We often underestimate the power of small actions, forgetting that the ripple of one choice can travel further than we imagine. A word of encouragement can save someone from despair. A simple act of generosity can restore dignity to a broken heart. Just as the young man in the story turned his city into a beacon of hope, we too can turn our everyday environments into places where faith and love breathe life again. There's also a lesson about leadership here. True leadership doesn't come from position or power, but from service. We live in a time when many are searching for examples to follow, people who stand not above others, but beside them. In our daily routines, we can embody this kind of leadership. Whether we are parents guiding our children, students inspiring classmates, or employees bringing integrity to our work, we have the chance to lead by example. The city's transformation began when someone dared to live their faith out loud. Imagine what would happen if we all chose to live with that same authenticity. The change would not only touch our homes but would overflow into our communities, workplaces, and beyond. What resonates most is that pain and setbacks were not avoided, but embraced as part of the journey. And isn't that true in life? We pray for easier paths, but it's often the hardships that shape us into who we are meant to be. Just like the young man who almost gave up after tragedy struck, we too face moments that test our faith and resilience. But if we hold on, if we refuse to let pain have the last word, those very wounds can become testimonies of strength. In our everyday struggles, financial difficulties, broken relationships, personal failures, we are invited to see not endings, but beginnings. Every scar tells a story, and every story has the power to inspire someone else to keep going. Ultimately, this story is not about one city, but about the potential inside each of us. The lesson is clear: when faith meets action, nothing is impossible. The same way an entire city was reborn, our lives can be reshaped if we choose to believe and act with courage. So as you carry this story with you, remember that transformation is closer than it seems. Maybe your life, your family, your workplace, or even your community is waiting for you to take that first step. And when you do, others will follow, because light always attracts those searching in darkness. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this journey. Your time, your attention, and your heart mean everything. If this story touched you, if it inspired you to see your own struggles differently, I invite you to share it with someone who might need the same encouragement today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories we bring to life. And if you believe that faith and hope can transform not only cities but also lives, help us spread that message by liking this video and sharing it with as many people as you can. Together, we can create ripples of change far beyond what we imagine.